Welcome to this webinar, IEP versus Section 504. Today we have with us Naté, Dearden, and Jennifer Slade from the Utah State Office of Education. Naté is an education specialist over dispute resolution with the Department of Special Education Services. Jennifer is with the Department of Education Equity and is an education specialist over Section 504. I am the host, Linda Smith, and I am a parent consultant with the Utah Parent Center. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the Utah Parent Center website. If you have any questions, you can type them into the question box on your computer. I will say if you have a personal question about a particular child or school situation, we will answer. We will contact you later, or you can contact us. The Utah Parent Center parent consultants would love to talk to you about your personal issues, as well as Jennifer and Naté will provide their contact information at the end of this webinar. Be sure to take the time to complete the evaluation at the conclusion of this webinar. Your input is very important to us. So I will turn the time over to Naté and Jennifer, and you can type in your questions at any time.
Thanks, Linda. This is Naté, and I'm going to kind of start us off, and then Jennifer and I are going to tag team, and she's going to share some stuff as well. So yeah, today we planned on just doing kind of a basic overview. We know that some of this can get a little complicated or complex, so just like Linda said, if there's a piece of this that comes up that you're not sure about or you want to know more about, just give us a call. But today we plan to just share some basic points, and then you'll see some similarities. You'll also see some differences. And this is kind of a confusing thing for a lot of parents as well as educators, and so we will try to make it clear, but please ask questions if you get confused. So one of the first things to understand and know, the IDEA, or the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and Section 504 are similar in that they both have child find and FAPE regulations. Child find is basically that concept that if a family or a school is on notice that a student has a disability that may be impacting them, that we need to identify those children, we need to evaluate them to determine whether or not they may qualify for services. Additionally, the FAPE requirement is just that requirement that students with disabilities that are being impacted have that access to a free, appropriate public education. So what we wanted to do, I kind of learned well by kind of looking at contrasts, and so we made this basic chart that will go through a couple of slides to kind of just show you some of those similarities or differences. So first of all, as you can see, when we talk about a child who has an IEP or a child who has a 504 plan, they kind of both serve the same purpose in that it's a blueprint or a plan for the child. With a student who has an IEP, that would kind of govern their quote-unquote special education experience at school. But 504 is a similar plan that's really about access to learning and making sure kids can be successful. When you look at what each of those plans do, you'll see with an IEP, one of the letters in IEP is individualized. And so school teams have, created this individualized plan. A student receives specialized education and related services to meet their unique needs. But similar, a student with a 504 plan would also receive some services and perhaps changes to the learning environment to meet their needs so that they can be successful. Some of the reason why there's differences are because these two plans are covered by different laws. The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act is a federal special education act, a federal law, and it came into place in the 70s, and it's something that sometimes they call entitlement. and that children who qualify are entitled to these services. Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, it was designed as a civil rights law to stop discrimination. And so when you understand that, it kind of helps you see why there's a little bit different focus. And as we go on to the next slide, we'll kind of look at how knowing they came from two different laws kind of shows why they're a little bit different, why these plans are different. So one of the things that is different about them is the IDEA gets a lot more specific and has a lot of regulations around the individualized education program, whereas Section 504 is a little more general and it kind of gives schools freedom and flexibility to create things. So even though you'll see similarities between the plans, the IDEA really regulates what is in an IEP. So in terms of eligibility, and Jennifer's going to answer some questions and cover a little bit more about 504 eligibility after we get through this chart because it can be tricky. But in terms of eligibility for an IEP, a student needs to kind of qualify for the criteria of one of 13 specific disabilities that are listed in that federal IDEA law. So first they look at, does the student qualify in one of these categories? And if so, if we determine they have one of these disabilities, is that disability impacting their educational performance or their ability to learn and benefit from the general education curriculum? If the school, based on these evaluations and the family, kind of look at the data and look at how the student is doing and they determine that, they would find the student eligible. Likewise, with a 504 plan, the definition is broader. There aren't 13 limited categories. Instead, the law says, is there a disability or a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities? Jennifer's going to go through some of those life activities with you. But similar to the IDEA, we look at, is that child's disability affecting their ability to learn in a general education classroom? So if you were to find a student eligible under either one of these plans, we would proceed to create a program or a plan to serve that child. So again, the IDEA is a little more specific and they tell us who has to be on this IEP team. And of course, family is a big part of that, but it also asks for general and special educators, so we kind of have that mixed perspective. A school psychologist or somebody who can interpret evaluation results because it needs to be based on, some formal data, as well as somebody who has authority over special education services and can commit resources. And that's what's typically called an Ellie A rep. Different, when we look at 504 plan, the law just says there needs to be a team of people who are familiar with the child, who understand evaluation data and special services options. When you see that sentence, I think you can see a lot of overlap with what we just looked at with an IEP. It will still probably be a lot of similar type people. We'll have a parent, a general education teacher, a school counselor, and often an administrator. And just note that for students who may have some medical needs related to their disability, it's important to include a nurse and if the student has that individual health care plan. So the team gets together, or the group of folks get together to create this plan. And again, the IDEA is very specific about what needs to go into an IEP. And so we'll have some statements about how the student's presently performing, and then we're required to have goals that kind of address, weaknesses or limitations that the student needs to be working on. There will be services, and the law even requires us to kind of specify how much services will be provided, when will they be provided, accommodations and modifications, as well as will they be participating in standardized testing, how that looks, do they need accommodations for that? And a big component is how they'll be included in general education settings. With both of these laws, one of the purposes is to make sure that students are able to access general education, the core curriculum, as much as possible. And so we often talk about these as services. They're not a place. We don't want the kids necessarily to go to a room and just be there. We want them to access general ed as much as possible. With 504 plans, we don't have as much regulations about what needs to be in them, but what you'll often see is what we have up here in the bullets. It will list some specific accommodations, supports, or services that the child needs, and it will include who's providing those services and who's responsible. And so even though the law doesn't tell 504 plans, you need to have all of these things. Good practice, best practice is to be specific, to have things written down, and to have those shared with anybody who's working with the students so we can make sure students are receiving those services and that plan is being implemented. You'll see some similarities here, both with an IEP and a 504 plan. It is required to review at least annually. And then every 3 years, the law requires us to reevaluate and determine if the students still need services. How do parents fit into this? You know, we said earlier they are a part of the decision-making process, a part of the team, but we need parent consent in writing before we evaluate children. And so if you're looking at a child and trying to figure out if they would qualify for either one of these things, we need to get parent evaluation or parent consent before we evaluate. Additionally, with an IEP, we have to have consent in writing from a parent before we actually start providing those services. There's also some notice requirements. For an IEP, if a child changes services or placement, meaning they go to a more restrictive setting or go to a less restrictive setting, parents need to have notice of that in writing. And some of that's so that we make sure parents are included in decision making and so they know what's going on. Additionally, the IDA requires any IEP meetings, any evaluations that are happening, parents need to have notice of that so they can participate. With 504, we've got the requirement that schools need to notify parents about evaluations or significant changes in placement. And again, written consent is considered a best practice. Similarly, both laws have an avenue that parents and schools can utilize when problems come up or questions. And so we have dispute resolution processes that are available through both processes. So with the IEP, and you can access a lot of these through the state for free. You can contact us, you can look on our website, but you can have help such as mediation. Parents can file a complaint. They can request a due process hearing. But what we found in many cases is if there's problems with services being provided or disagreement, we can often handle those by having a facilitator come to an IEP meeting or having a mediation session. If you look at 504 plans, similar, they have mediation and due process hearings as an option. Something that's a little different is parents or schools have the option to file a complaint with the Regional Office for Civil Rights. And that goes back to the law that establishes this plan. It was a civil rights law. It is to protect against discrimination. And so if parents feel that their child is being discriminated against, this is an avenue that they can come to. In terms of funding and costs, another difference, the IDEA is funded. It's not fully funded by the federal government, so it's also we also have state funding that helps with that. So schools receive funding that helps to serve eligible students, but parents don't have to pay for that. These services are provided free of cost to families. That's the same with students on a 504 plan. Families don't have to pay for these services. However, the difference is states and school districts don't get extra funding for that. And so you'll see this, this slide says federal government can take away funding if we are not complying. And there's that differentiation that we can't use special education funding to serve students with 504 plans. So that will often come from the general fund. Okay, so I think I've kind of covered my slides. I'm going to turn the time over to Jennifer. I don't see any questions right now, so we will just keep it moving.
Good afternoon. It's great to be with all of you out there. I'm just going to go through a little bit more because sometimes IDEA is more understood than 504, and so as you can see on the screen, it's available to all students with disabilities that don't qualify for special education. 504 is. If kids are having issues, not doing well in school, there's some red flag things going on, then they may be eligible under 504. Oh, there. So I'm just going to reiterate the substantially limiting regulations for 504. So as you can see, it's a person who has a mental or physical impairment that substantially limits one or more of the person's major life activities. So you can see on the screen there's quite a few there. One of those listed is operation of a bodily function. So in 2010, OCR reiterated that bodily functions, if a student has are substantially limited at accessing their education because of a bodily function, which can include kids with asthma, diabetes, IBS, anxiety, bipolar, autism, all of those things that are neurological or, heart-related, any of those things can be covered under 504, a major life activity. One thing that's important to note about a major life activity, Congress has defined it as substantially limiting as to the general population. So you look at the peers in the classroom, and if a student is struggling, then in comparison to the general population, then that does substantially limit them with a major life activity.
Sorry, we do have some questions, but
we can answer them.
Okay.
You see there's some questions there, so we'll go ahead and answer them.
Sorry, I didn't have them expanded, so I think some of you have been asking questions. Let's pop them out.
Oh, there they are.
So one of the questions is, will we be able to get a copy of the PowerPoint? It's my sense that you are. Oh, and you had that question answered. So one of the questions, where do I find the list of the 13 disabilities that are covered for the IEP? You can look in the Utah State Office of Education Special Education rules. That includes the categories, or you could call the Parent Center. It's also in the federal law, and that's online. I'm sure the Parent Center has some resources on their website, so I'll let Linda speak to that.
The Utah Parent Center also has a publication, Parents as Partners in the IEP Process Handbook, and they are also listed in there.
Perfect. And so then we have two questions that I think are kind of related. Does an IEP trump 504, or when would a student have both an IEP and a 504? And so I'll let Jennifer speak a little bit to that.
Sure. So if a student qualifies for an IEP, they can have all services that they need served under an IEP. So not generally would they have a 504 and an IEP, and I'll give you an example of that. So I know at one point some people felt that if there was a student that had an IEP but had some mobility issues, that transportation would be covered under 504. But transportation can be written right into an IEP, and so if they qualify for an IEP, that's where they should be served. And if they don't qualify for an IEP, then they should have a 504, which can also serve transportation, counseling, OT, PT, any of those related services students might need that don't qualify for special ed. So I hope that answers that.
You ready to go to the next slide?
So there are two more prongs with the regulations for the criteria for eligibility, and that's having a record of such an impairment and is regarded as having an impairment. And those two prongs are specifically related to if happens to be a possible discrimination or negative action occur because of the record or history of a person having an impairment or being regarded as having an impairment. Because if they're regarded in that way, there's chances, or, you know, teachers are always saying, or parents are always saying, oh my gosh, my child's really struggling, or this student in my class, I just don't know how they're going to make it. Those kinds of things happening around that child would be part of these two prongs if they don't receive services, and then a school could be found in violation of child find or FAPE in these cases. Oh, go ahead. So when you look at 504, this is guidance that came out probably around 2010. These are the notices that are required for 504. So you can see here they're pretty identical to what is required for IDEA. The one thing that is different with 504, for example, when you're looking at the notices, is that, I'm trying to remember now, sorry. I just had a brain block. That's what happens when you're on webinar. They're pretty much the same. So the procedural safeguards are different, a little bit different than the IDEA safeguards. However, they still have similar processes. So if you don't have the list of procedural safeguards for 504, the IDEA ones, OCR would say that they were given safeguards if that's all you had to give. But we do have those. They're in the Section 504 Parent Guidebook that you can access at our website in the equity section at USOE, and also it is in the Administrator and Educator Guidebook. So they are there for you to do. It's a one-page procedural safeguard, and it, just like IDEA, you should offer them every time you see or talk to a parent in meetings, just like we do for IDEA is best practice. So the difference with 504 in identifying and looking at evaluations is in the regulations it talks about the things that you should look at. And it's interesting to note here that you also look at how the kids are adapting socially, as well as their cultural background, their physical condition. You can look at aptitude tests, you can do achievement tests, and I've told educators out there that if your gut feeling is a student will probably qualify for an IEP, that it's good practice to go ahead and do that evaluation. And then if they don't qualify, they don't meet the RTI or discrepancy model or the combination of the two, then you've got that information that you can use for the 504 meeting. So it's never a bad idea to do that, especially if there might be some, where you might think there might be some learning disabilities that would be significant. So just make sure that you look at everything that you have available. And what the regulations say is to make sure the placement decision is made by a group of persons, including persons knowledgeable about the child, the meaning of the evaluation data, and the placement. So that it doesn't say specifically who should be there, but best practice is an Ellie A, the parent, regular ed teachers, and any psychologist, anybody that can read the data that you need there to read data. And parents also have a right to bring an advocate with them to 504 meetings if they choose. So just because sometimes there's a misunderstanding about an accommodation and a modification, 504s are generally, are almost always accommodations, where the specialized instruction, specially designed instruction for IEPs are often modifications. However, they could be accommodations as well. So we just kind of wanted you to understand the difference between the two. And you can see that accommodations, which 504 is a level the playing field law, you know, it kind of levels the playing field for students. That's what an accommodation does. And it provides equal access to instruction and assessment for the students with disabilities, again, determined on an individual basis. Where modifications might alter the instruction a little bit, might be one-on-one, small group, which could also be an accommodation, but then the assessments and maybe the amount of material that the students complete is modified, or, for example, if you're in 7th grade and the student's reading on a 4th grade reading level, you may find materials that take that content and put it at their reading level. That would modify, be a modification as well. So we also this chart was found, I found it on How They're Different. It's done by E. Strom, and I adapted it a little bit so that you can just kind of have a graphic organizer where you can look at back and forth as you're making decisions with students to kind of see, what works best. So, accommodations help kids have access to the same materials and meet the same expectations as their classmates, where again I talked about that the modification may change what that assignment is, a shorter assignment, less homework. So kind of look at those C's, and you can go through and look at those. The testing, same thing. So statewide assessments, you would follow the criteria for that. Students with 504s can also have extended time and some other accommodations during that as well. So if you have questions, you can always email us or talk to us. Okay, so are there any questions?
I'm going to see. I think there are.
Yeah, so we're going to answer questions now, and then we have our information up on the screen. And like Naté said, anytime if you feel like it's a service issue or the IEP is not being written correctly, contact Naté and she can assist you with that. If you feel like there's been discrimination, and then you would contact me. 504 does the discrimination piece for a student with an IEP that maybe wasn't implemented, or anything that you feel is discriminatory. Discrimination based on they are a student with a disability. For example, the district's refusing to allow them to go on a field trip because of their disability. That would be me. So let's look at the questions.
Okay, we have a lot of good questions. And I was kind of trying to see if any of them matched. So, we had a comment, and one of the comments was modifications and accommodations seem too similar to distinguish from each other. And I understand that. I mean, it is kind of difficult to differentiate sometimes. So what I'd encourage you to do is look at, we didn't spend, enough time on that chart for you to probably read all of it. But I'd encourage you to look at that, and then you could get in touch with Jennifer or I or the Parent Center. There are resources online, but I think the big thing for me to help me remember is the modification. It really does sometimes change or lower the expectation. So for example, you give an assignment, student may only be required to complete 10 of the questions instead of 20, and things like that. And in accommodation, you won't usually see that. You'll see things that help the student to complete that, such as extended time or some adjusted deadlines. That's just one tiny example, but it is a tricky thing, which is why we wanted to just touch on it, because we know that can be hard. Let's see. We will reach out to you if you asked us a question that was a little specific, for example, about your child or a situation you're familiar with. We have a question, what if a child is not allowed to participate in after-school programs due to their disability?
That's a discrimination issue, and you would contact me, and I can assist you with some options of either doing an inquiry with me, where I'll contact the school and explain what the federal laws are and what their obligations are, or you're welcome to file a state complaint with me. It's very similar to the inquiry, but it's a little bit more formal. Or you can go directly to the Office for Civil Rights and file. You always have a right to do that. We highly recommend you start with me, just because I can generally get stuff. I know a lot of the 504 coordinators around the state, and sometimes I can get it resolved within a couple of phone calls versus waiting 6 weeks for OCR to even decide to investigate. So it's a good place to start, but anytime during that process, even if you start with me, you feel like it's not going anywhere, you can file with the OCR.
I think that's something that we see in both laws, both laws talk about how kids need access, and it's not just to general education class, it's to extracurricular activities, it's to lunch, recess, like you're talking about here, after school programs. So some people, some schools just don't understand the law or may not understand how to provide some of those accommodations, and that's when Jennifer and I can come in and help them and kind of brainstorm or think about how we can make this work, because kids, those are important aspects of the school day, and kids need access to that too. One of the questions says, I think, was around some of our...
I can't hear you anymore.
Oh.
On the phone.
You can't hear me anymore? Hello? I don't think I bumped anything other than...
We're still going. Let me see if anybody can type in if they can hear us.
We're just checking audio.
Okay.
It looks like it's working, but does that...
Someone just in the question section, can you just type if you can hear us, and then we'll continue to answer the questions if you can hear us.
I'm going to pop it out because I have a hard time. Okay, it says others can hear fine, so I'm sorry if you can't, and we will try to remedy that. One of the questions I noticed was asking about how to access a facilitator or a parent advocate. So that's a great question. You can reach out to me if you'd like to ask for an IEP facilitator or mediator. We have forms on our USOE website. You can Google USOE dispute resolution. You could also talk to the Parent Center, and the Parent Center is a great resource to reach out to get connected with an advocate. The USOE also has some other advocates on contract that we can connect to families. Sorry.
That's all right. There's just someone that I can't see the bottom.
I'm just going to start at the bottom and work my way up to make sure I didn't miss anything.
There's the one about the coordinator. So it would be appropriate to be a 504 coordinator if a district or school doesn't have someone. So the 504 coordinator, every district should have one, and that's mandated by the federal government. So from the OCR regs. And schools should have a go-to person. So what the guidance says is that should be posted. So the person at the school to contact about a civil rights issue, and districts also once or twice a year I update the Title IX and Section 504 coordinator list, because those are required by the civil rights laws. Who would be a good person to be it? Some have Ellie A's, some have counselors, because oftentimes counselors are on the front line with kids. Some schools have their special ed people involved. However, you have to be very careful with that, because IDEA funds cannot pay for 504. So if part of their job is doing 504, being the 504 coordinator, there should be some general funds tied into their salary. Having any IDEA funds can cause funding issues for that school if they have their special ed person doing those. So yeah. So, and same requirements for a charter school. And I keep a list of charter schools that are 504 coordinators. The same thing. If a charter school has a special ed director, that is also the 504 coordinator. They should have two sources of funding for their salary, because that can be seen as an infraction and it's possible to lose your federal funds.
We had another question that says, can a 504 plan include modifications, or is it just an IEP that can include modifications?
504s do hardly ever. It would be very rare. And the reason is a 504 is a level the playing field law. So it would, an accommodation is what you would have on a 504. Extended time to finish assignments, and occasionally, and I'll give you an example. So occasionally there may be a modification of homework, and this is where that might be. If you've got a student who is taking 4 and 5 hours to do homework and their general peers are doing that same homework in 2 hours, that may be something that homework may be modified, because when OCR looks at that, and I've called and talked to OCR about this specific thing, if the student is staying up so late to do homework that it's affecting their access to their education the next day, that would be the only time that you might see a modification, is just, you know, maybe some less problems at home for homework, but still show the student understands and can demonstrate, you know, that they can generalize that concept.
Yeah, so I think that question goes to, if you're seeing a lot of need for modifications, that's when we're wondering, why didn't the student qualify for special ed? Let's go back and look at evaluations, let's look at data. And, you know, sometimes students may not qualify, but you could try later on. Just because we've had a meeting at one point in the student's education does not mean we're barred from that. We know that students change through development and all sorts of things, that issues may come up later on. Go ahead.
I just wanted to mention one more thing too with 504. So sometimes there is a misconception out there that if a student that probably should qualify for special ed but has behavior issues, that schools or districts sometimes want to just put them on a 504 plan, because then they think that they won't be held to the 10-day rule. Know that under 504 and IDEA, the 10-day rule applies to both, or a pattern of exclusion, and anything else that goes with that. If a change of placement, has to be a manifest determination done as well of the behavior. So know that goes for both laws.
That's great. We had a comment from one of our viewers, and I think it's a great thing to share. So just along the lines of that question about how do we tell between accommodations and modifications, she says, at our school we say accommodations help students reach the mountain peak a different way, but modifications change the mountain peak. So I thought that was a good comment to share. We had one question from a parent, and this comes up sometimes, where she said she's had her daughter evaluated by, you know, an outside specialist who recommended IDEA services in several areas, but the school is wanting to be able to also evaluate for an IEP. And then this questioner asks, if their conclusions aren't the same, what can a parent be empowered to do? So I think that does come up. We do know that through the IEP process, and Jennifer can correct me if I say anything wrong here, schools do need to do their evaluations, but they can consider other evaluations. And what we are looking for is, you know, a group of people coming together looking for consistency, data patterns, things like that. There are times when a school may do an evaluation and parent disagrees. So one of the rights under the IDEA is parents can request an independent evaluation after they disagree with the school's evaluation, and there's processes for that, so they can work with the school to ask that. Additionally, if parents feel really strongly that, you know, there are some needs there that aren't being met and it's backed up by these evaluations and data, that is when you could probably resort to some dispute resolution techniques. So you could try mediation, or you could file for due process and allow a due process hearing officer to make the decision. But
yeah, the only thing I wanted to add is, when you're looking at a medical diagnosis versus educational evaluations, they're very different in that the one from the doctor is made from a medical perspective, and the evaluations the school do and the school team look from an educational viewpoint. Educators cannot diagnose. So we use the tools we have and the access to their education and where they are with discrepancies in mathematics, language arts, etc., to make those determinations. But no, they are two very different evaluations done.
okay, so we've heard Jennifer say the term discrepancy a couple of times, and somebody had a question, what is RTI and what is a discrepancy model? And so to answer that, we'd have to give a lot of answer, but just basically, RTI is response to intervention, and that's a educational way of looking at students who are experiencing, difficulty in learning, and it's requiring schools to evaluate data, provide interventions, and kind of see if what's happening with instruction needs to change to help the student access and make progress. And it's something that could be applied to any student, right? It's not just special education.
Right. So it's like a
a model.
multi-system of supports. And so if kids are up in tier 3, for example, with an RTI, but say they've taken all the evaluation for IDEA and they don't meet the 2 standard deviation discrepancy, but if the school doing those intense, almost specialized instruction in tier 3 of an RTI model, a team can still make a decision to place that student in special ed if they're not for specialized instruction. And so looking at both of them kind of gives us gives a better picture of the student, where with RTI the intent is to give them intervention so then they can just do the work, but if those are pulled away and a kid is still struggling but didn't meet that 2 standard deviation, like I said, it's just another way to say, hey, this kid really does need help. So that's why some districts do the RTI and the discrepancy model.
And discrepancy, it's kind of a technical term, but it goes to when we're looking in the IDA to qualify a child as having a specific learning disability. We have to look at their evaluations, and there has to be a certain discrepancy for them to qualify. And so that's kind of more technical along the lines of students with learning disabilities. Someone had a question, where can we access these 504 notices? It sounds like this is from a school. We've looked and had a hard time finding these printouts to give to parents.
Okay, so it is in the back of the administrative guidebooks, and there is a Word template that currently isn't on our website but will be, but if you will email me, I will send you that Word template and you can personalize it for your school or your district, and then you can use those forms. Note they're samples, and since it's not prescriptive, you can tweak them a little bit that works good for you. For example, the parent questionnaire that's in there, a district said, can we put in there questions that parents can ask their students so we get a better picture of the student? So absolutely, you can do a little bit of tweaking that way if needs be. Just email me, I'll be happy to send you the Word template.
Okay, we have a couple questions that kind of seem connected to me. We have one question, what's the difference between specific reading disability qualification under IDEA, which I'm going to just correct that. There's specific learning disability, and then it can be in certain areas such as reading or math, and a reading impairment under 504.
So again, it would have to do with that 2 standard deviation, or the 2 standard deviation on the discrepancy model. So if they don't meet that criteria, then their reading can be served under 504 with accommodations. Generally, if it does meet the IDEA requirement, then they really do need specialized instruction, where a 504 they just need some tools or extra time to access their education.
And this is one I'm sure Jennifer gets a lot because I've heard it too, kind of questions about ADHD, students with ADHD qualifying for a 504 plan. Is that something that happens, and what does that look like?
Sure, it does happen, and where it happens is when you're looking at that substantially limit model. Are they having a difficult time concentrating? Is it an executive function piece? So no, not all kids with ADHD will have a 504 plan, but if it's impacting their access to their education or their behaviors impacting that, then they can also have a FUBA and a BIP under 504 if they didn't qualify for IDEA. So not all kids will, but if it affects their access to education, yes.
We had a question, can you expand on the life activity of helping?
Okay, so when those are just basic ones that the 504 regs include. So you're talking about the ones I listed on the slide. Mm-hmm. So helping may just be general kinds of things, doing general activities, like helping around the classroom, helping peers. I don't have any specifics. That's not usually one kids qualify with, but it is one that they have put in the regulations. So The important thing to note about 504 is that schools should just not look at learning. And so just a quick example, if you've got a student with asthma, they're going to be substantially limited in their breathing. So they are a kid with a disability. However, they may not need a 504 accommodation plan, but it is something you should review if their asthma starts, they start missing a lot of school and missing out on access to their education.
Okay, so a couple questions about some things we've said. When Jennifer's talking about RTI, she mentioned different tiers. If you look into RTI, it's a pyramid model. So you see tier 1 is on the bottom, tier 2 is in the middle, and tier 3 is at the top. And that's kind of to symbolize that, you know, there's just different interventions. Tier 1 would a school would be providing to all students. Tier 2 would be to smaller groups, and Tier 3 is really individualized and technical. And so that's why when Jennifer's saying when you've got a student getting a lot of Tier 3, that's meaning the school's already working with them individually in a really technical way, and that kind of tips us off that maybe a special education evaluation should be occurring, or we should look into that because it's a more intense intervention than what we're doing for all kids. I think she also mentioned a FUBA, and someone might have misheard that. So that's FBA, and it stands for Functional Behavior Assessment. And so it's that piece she's saying, if you're seeing behavior issues, there's specific behavior evaluations that we do to kind of determine what's impacting the behavior, and that helps us develop a behavior intervention plan. We have a question about, do kids with IEPs in high school graduate the same as everyone else, and do they receive a completion certificate instead of graduation? And that's kind of case specific, but generally, yeah, most kids with an IEP will earn a high school diploma. And that's because if they're able to complete the required coursework, then, you know, they earn it just the same as any other kid. We will see some kids with intellectual disabilities or more significant disabilities who may not be able to complete that coursework due to, you know, those things. And so those students will end up probably getting a completion certificate rather than graduation. Okay, and I'm getting some information from the Parent Center that they have information about RTI on their website. If you search for MTSS, which stands for Multi-Tiered Systems of Support, so M as in mouse, TSS for response to intervention, and you'll see some things pop up. We had a question about, is medical documentation required for a 504?
No, it is not as per an OCR decision. However, it is really important to get all viewpoints. So for parents out there, and I've been telling providers as well as I've worked with doctors and clinicians and stuff, it is important to have all the information about the students so that the school can make the best decisions for that child. But if a parent chooses out of giving that medical diagnosis, a school cannot delay doing a 504 evaluation. I highly encourage you to just, you know, remind parents that you're just trying to do the best, and for parents, schools are just trying to do the best for your student, for your child. So I encourage you to allow that to happen. If you're more comfortable, the school nurse can communicate with the doctor so that she can translate from medicalese to, you know, what educators may understand better. But no, by law, by OCR decision, they do not have to provide that.
One question we had was, what does Ellie A stand for? So we're sorry for using a term you weren't familiar with. That stands for Local Education Agency, and it's just kind of another term that federal law uses in place of school districts. So when we say Ellie A, we're often referring to a public school district or, you know, public charter school district. We had a comment, do counselors that take on 504 caseloads require additional salary compensation? Did we hear that correctly? I think not. I think what Jennifer was saying is, if you're managing a 504 caseload as well as a special education caseload, schools need to make sure they are adjusting salary accordingly. You cannot use special education funds to pay for 504 casework.
Right,
So
so
it's not
one-
extra, it's just making sure, you know, if you 20% of the time was for 504, then 20% of the pay or the money dedicated toward that comes from the general fund rather than IDEA funds. We had a question, if a child with behavior difficulties due to a disability, can they be threatened to be kicked off the bus?
It depends. So if the student is going, you know, is a risk to other students, a dangerous student, so say they're threatening to hurt or they bring a weapon on the bus, then there is a possibility that they can be kicked off the bus. However, there still should be a manifestation determination to determine, you know, what that is. However, if it's a student that's the only way they can get to school, the IEP team and the 504 team may have to look at some other options.
Great. Sorry, jumping around. We're trying to make sure we cover everything. We had a question, what's the difference between SLD and LD qualifications? I think we just often hear specific learning disability or learning disability. It's the same category in IDEA. IDEA just says specific learning disability. Will we be able to receive a copy of this PowerPoint? Yep, if you were signed up, I think you got an email with the attachment, or you can access it.
It's in there.
It's embedded in there.
It's
If you hit the orange arrow,
if you hit the orange arrow, you can
see the three
you can see the 3 attachments that came along with this that you can download. A question, did I hear that public and charter schools are held to the same process standards for IEP and 504 as public schools? Yes, that's what you heard. So these are federal laws, but they're also included in our state laws, and we at the USOE hold public school districts and charter school districts accountable for following these laws.
Sure, and the charter schools, the OCR wrote a Dear Colleague letter just specific to charter schools and their obligation to follow all the federal rules as public schools, because they are a public school. They receive federal funds, and if they receive federal funds, they have to follow these federal laws, and by not doing so, they could be in jeopardy of losing their federal funds.
We have a question where a parent says, you know, my student has several diagnoses but is high functioning and the school refuses to put him on an IEP. What are my options? And so just like we talked about earlier, you do have just different dispute resolution options. You can contact Jennifer or I, or contact the Parent Center, and we would be happy to share more and tell you how you can access those things. Question, I've been told that if a student has a health care plan, they should have a 504.
What the OCR regs say is every student that has an individual health care plan should be considered for a 504. Not every student with an individual health care plan will have a 504, but a way you can kind of judge is a student who's missing a lot of school because of their medical issues, or for example, a student with diabetes is out of class, is a type 1 diabetic and is out of class dealing with those quite a bit. They would have a 504 plan on how to access their education. Also, a kid with allergies severe allergies would probably have a 504 plan so that the classroom teacher knows how to keep the environment as safe as possible for that student.
We have a question about the ACT test and applying for accommodations. I think it came from a school. I could be wrong.
That is all done through the specific testing sites. So anything that's through the College Board, ACT, the SAT, your AP tests, anything that's through the College Board, you have to go to their websites and apply for those accommodations online.
And they'll have some specific information about what is required if you have questions about what you need to submit for documentation.
Right. And they don't always allow the accommodation even if you submit an IEP or 504, because they are held to Part E of the 504 and not Part D. So their criteria looks very different, and that's a long conversation. So if you want to know more about that, contact me.
Jennifer, can you give me an idea of how much time they should plan to apply for those
As
accommodations?
early as possible. I would do it months before the test because they get so many accommodation requests that you really should, you know, I'd say if you're going to take the test in the fall, in the spring, I would start applying in the fall, or I would apply in the spring if you plan on taking it in the fall. Apply much earlier because they do get a lot of requests, and sometimes they're down to the last few weeks and people haven't heard. So apply early.
One last question, then one comment, and we'll wrap it up. So we have a question, can a child be on an IEP and not be pulled out of class to a special ed classroom? That's a great question, and yeah, that can happen. I think what I tried to state earlier, and I'll say again, and the Parent Center, I've heard them say this too, special education is a service, it's not a place. And so some of our students, it really depends on what their needs are and what's on their plan. Some kids may need to be pulled out of gen ed sometimes and get some extra help and intervention, but best practice is they're in the general ed as much as possible. So some schools will have folks push in and help them. There will be services that the general education teacher can provide because we want them to be included as much as possible. When kids are, we see better outcomes in terms of grades as well as social outcomes because they're included with their peers and able to benefit from everything that everybody else is. And then I'll just end on a comment that came from one of the participants because I think it's a great ending. She says, I'm new to this process and working through this with my daughter. I really appreciate the time and information provided. I'm hoping the school and I together are able to help provide my daughter with the tools she needs to have a good learning experience. Thanks for all that you're doing. So please reach out to us. You know, we've got to end because we're at our hour limit. But Jennifer and I are happy to talk to you. I know the Parent Center has so many great resources, so I will turn the time back over to Linda.
We want to thank Jennifer and Naté for coming today. I want to remind you once again to please complete the evaluation and remind you that you can download the handouts that are here, and thank you for attending.